The air hangs heavy over Rome on the night of July 18th to 19th, 64 AD. It's the kind of suffocating heat that makes sleep impossible, that sends residents stumbling onto their rooftops, desperate for any whisper of a breeze. The full moon casts silver across the city, illuminating 1,000,000 lives packed into rickety wooden structures that lean over narrow streets like drunken giants. In the shops clustered around the Circus Maximus, merchants have locked up their stores crammed with oil, cloth, and other goods that will fuel the coming inferno. They don't know it yet, but in a few hours their city will become a furnace. Somewhere in that maze of timber and thatch, in those cramped quarters where Rome's poor sleep stacked on top of each other in 5-story death traps, a flame catches. Maybe it's a knocked-over lamp, maybe it's an ember from a cooking fire, or maybe, as whispers will soon claim, it's something far more sinister. The wind picks up, carrying that single flame across dried wood, and within minutes, what started as a flicker becomes a beast. By dawn, Rome is burning, and before the smoke clears, an emperor will be accused of the greatest crime in the city's history, and an entire religious community will be fed to the lions. This is the story of the Great Fire of Rome. A disaster so catastrophic it consumed 70% of the eternal city. A tragedy so suspicious that 2,000 years later we're still asking the same question. Was it an accident, or was it the work of the most infamous emperor Rome ever produced? Rome, in the 1st century, was a city eating itself alive. Over 1,000,000 people crammed into an urban sprawl that had grown like a tumor, with no planning, no organization, no mercy for those at the bottom. The wealthy lived on the Palatine Hill in their marble villas, looking down on the chaos below. But the rest, they lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings constructed from the cheapest materials imaginable: wood frames, mud brick, thatch roofs. These structures leaned across streets so narrow you could reach from one window and touch the building across from you. The historian Tacitus, who was 8 years old when the fire broke out, would later describe these neighborhoods in terms that make it clear why disaster was inevitable. Narrow, winding streets, buildings crammed together with no open spaces, no temples, nothing to slow a fire once it got moving. The ground floors housed shops selling flammable goods, oil and grain and cloth, while families lived in the stories above, stacked like cordwood. During the day, these streets roared with commerce and humanity. At night, they became something else entirely: dark, airless, perfect kindling, waiting for a spark. Fires were nothing new in Rome. The city burned regularly. Small fires, large fires, fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. Augustus had tried to address the problem back in 22 BC by funding a fire brigade. Later, in 6 AD, he established the vigiles, the cohorts of the watchmen, 7,000 men tasked with patrolling the city and fighting fires. But the vigiles were equipped with buckets, blankets, vinegar, axes to demolish buildings and create firebreaks. When you're facing an inferno that's devouring a city of 1,000,000 people, buckets don't cut it. The night the fire started, those shops near the Circus Maximus went up like torches. The wind, coming in hot off the surrounding hills, grabbed the flames and threw them into the residential quarters. Within hours, entire districts were ablaze. The fire moved so fast that people barely had time to grab their children before fleeing. Some tried to save their neighbors. Some tried to save their possessions. Most just ran, joining the river of humanity, flooding toward the city gates, toward the open fields beyond the walls. Anywhere the air wasn't thick with smoke and ash and the screams of those who couldn't escape. For 6 days, Rome burned. The vigiles tried everything. They demolished buildings ahead of the flames, trying to create breaks the fire couldn't cross. They hauled water from the aqueducts. They worked until they collapsed. But nothing stopped it. Tacitus describes flames consuming the Palatine Hill, devouring temples that had stood for centuries, ancient buildings that were supposed to be eternal. The temple of Jupiter Stator, built in honor of Romulus himself, gone. The house of the Vestals, where sacred flames had burned for generations, consumed by flames of a very different kind. Even Nero's own palace, the Domus Aurea, was destroyed. And then, just when it seemed the fire was finally dying, when the exhausted survivors thought the nightmare was over, it reignited. For 3 more days it burned, spreading into districts that had been spared the first time. When the smoke finally cleared, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged. 3 were completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. The death toll? Unknown. In a city where the poor barely existed in official records, who's counting? So where was the emperor during all of this? That's where the story gets interesting. According to Tacitus, the most reliable historian we have for these events, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was 35 miles away at his villa in Antium, enjoying the cooler coastal weather while his city turned into an oven. When word reached him, he rushed back. And here's where the historical record and popular legend diverge in fascinating ways. Tacitus credits Nero with organizing relief efforts. The emperor opened his private gardens to refugees. He had emergency shelters constructed in the field of Mars. He brought in food from Ostia and neighboring towns and reduced the price of corn to prevent starvation. By all accounts, Nero responded to the disaster with efficiency and concern. But none of that mattered, because while the emperor was organizing aid, while he was housing the homeless and feeding the hungry, rumors were already spreading through the refugee camps like a second fire. The story went like this. While Rome burned, Nero had returned not to help, but to perform. He'd climbed to his private stage, some said the Tower of Maecenas on the Esquiline Hill, and watched the destruction while playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. He'd compared the burning of Rome to ancient catastrophes, celebrating the aesthetic beauty of the disaster while thousands died. The image is so vivid, so perfectly villainous, that it's persisted for 2 millennia. Nero fiddled while Rome burned has become shorthand for leadership so divorced from reality that it celebrates disaster.
There's just one problem. It's almost certainly not true. First, the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Nero played the kithara, a stringed instrument similar to a lyre. More importantly, no contemporary source actually claims he performed during the fire. The first account of Nero playing music while Rome burned comes from Cassius Dio, writing 150 years after the fact. Tacitus, who was actually alive during the fire and had access to eyewitnesses, never mentions it. What Tacitus does say is that while efforts were being made to fight the fire, word spread that Nero had been seen performing in a private home, singing of Troy's destruction. But he doesn't say this happened while the city was actively burning. So where did the legend come from? The most likely explanation points to Nero's reputation. the emperor was obsessed with performance. He saw himself as an artist, a poet, a musician forced by fate to be a ruler. His stage appearances scandalized the Roman elite, who thought emperors should act with dignity and restraint. Nero didn't care. He performed anyway. And when Rome burned and people were looking for someone to blame, it would have been natural to imagine that the emperor who loved spectacle had created the ultimate show. But the rumors didn't stop with Nero's alleged performance. Soon people were saying he'd started the fire deliberately, that he'd wanted to clear space for his building projects, that he'd ordered men to spread the flames. And when construction began on the Domus Aurea, Nero's new palace complex, those rumors hardened into what many Romans believed was certainty. The Domus Aurea was obscene. Spread across the Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills, covering an estimated 100 to 300 acres, it was less a palace than a personal empire within the city. Marble walls covered in gold leaf, rooms decorated with precious stones and ivory, rotating dining rooms with ceilings that showered guests with perfume in rose petals, an artificial lake big enough for naval battles, gardens and vineyards and pastures with actual livestock, creating the effect of countryside in the heart of the city. A 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself, designed to rival the Colossus of Rhodes, standing at the entrance. When Nero surveyed the finished portions, the only thing he said was that he was finally beginning to be housed like a human being. The Roman elite were horrified. They would have accepted such extravagance in the countryside, but in the city center, on land that had been neighborhoods where Romans lived, it was an extraordinary statement of power. And it made the rumors about the fire seem less like conspiracy theory and more like obvious fact. Of course Nero had burned Rome. Look at what he built in its place. The emperor needed a scapegoat, someone to blame, someone the Romans already hated, who nobody would defend. So Nero pointed at the Christians. In 64 AD, Christianity was barely 30 years old. It was a tiny sect, an offshoot of Judaism that most Romans had never heard of. They were strange. They refused to honor the Roman gods. They refused to perform the simple ritual of acknowledging the emperor's divine status, which everyone understood was basically a loyalty oath with religious window dressing. They held secret meetings and spoke of the end of the world, of a coming kingdom that would replace Rome itself. And they were exclusive in ways that made Romans deeply uncomfortable. You couldn't just add Jesus to your household gods, you had to choose Christ over everything else. The Romans called them atheists because they rejected the gods. They accused them of cannibalism because Christian communion spoke of eating flesh and drinking blood. Rumors spread of incestuous orgies because Christians called each other brother and sister and spoke of holy love. Most of this was misunderstanding and fear of the unfamiliar, but it made Christians perfect targets.
According to Tacitus, Nero declared that Christians had started the fire. First, those who admitted their faith were arrested. Then, using information obtained through interrogation, vast numbers were rounded up. Tacitus is clear that they weren't convicted of arson, they were convicted of hatred of the human race, which seems to have been code for their refusal to participate in Roman society and religion. The punishments were designed to fit the crime of fire and to provide entertainment for a traumatized population. Some Christians were covered in the skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified. But the most horrific punishment was reserved for those accused of actually setting the flames. They were covered in pitch, tied to stakes, and set on fire at night to serve as human torches lighting Nero's gardens during his parties. Tacitus, who despised Christians and called Christianity a destructive superstition, still expresses sympathy for them. He writes that despite what they were accused of, they deserved pity because they were being destroyed, not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's cruelty. Among those killed in Nero's persecution, early Christian tradition claims, were the apostles Peter and Paul. According to these accounts, Peter was crucified upside down in Nero's circus on grounds that would centuries later house St. Peter's Basilica. Paul, as a Roman citizen, would have been granted the mercy of beheading rather than a slower execution. Whether these specific martyrdoms occurred during this persecution remains debated by historians, but what's certain is that the persecutions which claimed an unknown number of lives had a profound effect on Christianity. The religion that Nero tried to destroy through terror would use those same martyrs as proof of faith's power. The blood of the martyrs, as the saying goes, became the seed of the church. So, did Nero do it? Did he actually order his city burned? 2,000 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer. Let's look at the evidence. Against Nero, we have circumstantial motivation. He did want to rebuild Rome in a more organized fashion. He did immediately begin construction on the most extravagant palace complex Rome had ever seen. Ancient sources describe men throwing torches and spreading flames while claiming to be under orders, though whether these men were actually following Nero's commands, working as looters using the chaos as cover, or acting as firefighters creating fire breaks remains unclear. Some ancient historians, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, were convinced of Nero's guilt. But in favor of accident, we have compelling practical evidence. Rome was a tinderbox. Fires were common. The combination of wooden buildings, narrow streets, summer heat and strong winds made large fires not just possible, but inevitable. It had happened before. It would happen again. Tacitus himself, our best source, explicitly says that authors gave both accounts and that the truth remained unknown. He notes the rumors about Nero, but doesn't endorse them.
We also have Nero's response. His relief efforts were swift and substantial. He did house refugees. He did stabilize food prices. He did implement new building codes afterward, requiring wider streets, stone construction, and fire-resistant materials. These weren't the actions of someone who wanted the city destroyed. They were the actions of someone trying to prevent it from happening again. Modern historians largely conclude that the fire was an accident. The urban conditions made it almost inevitable. Some scholars have noted that the timing, during a full moon on a hot July night, seems inconsistent with deliberate arson, since visibility was high and people were awake due to the heat, though this remains interpretive. The fire's path, spreading based on wind patterns, doesn't suggest intentional planning. And the destruction included Nero's own palace, hardly the work of someone trying to clear space for construction. What seems most likely, based on the available evidence, is that Nero was guilty not of starting the fire, but of exploiting it. He took advantage of the disaster to rebuild Rome according to his vision. And when people blamed him, he deflected that blame onto an unpopular minority. The persecution of Christians wasn't about finding the real culprits. It was about giving the mob someone to hate, while Nero built his golden palace on the ashes of their homes. The Great Fire of Rome burned for 9 days. It destroyed 70% of the Eternal City. It killed thousands, displaced hundreds of thousands more, and led to the first state-sponsored persecution of Christians. Whether accident or conspiracy, Its effects rippled through history. Nero's Domus Aurea, that monument to imperial excess, was buried and built over by his successors who wanted to erase his memory. The Colosseum was built on the site of his artificial lake, returning the land to public use. But those scratches on history, those burn marks in the historical record, never quite faded. 2,000 years later, we're still fascinated by that night in July, still wondering what really happened, still arguing about emperors and fires in truth and lies, because the story of Nero and the Great Fire isn't really about one night in ancient Rome. It's about power and how it responds to disaster. It's about scapegoating and persecution. It's about the stories we tell and the legends we create when the truth is uncomfortable or unclear. Did Nero fiddle while Rome burned? Almost certainly not. Did he start the fire? Probably not. But did he use the disaster to consolidate power, to build monuments to his own ego, and to destroy those who threatened his vision of Rome? Absolutely. And maybe that's the real crime worth remembering. If stories like this remind you that history is never as simple as the legends suggest, that the truth is always more complicated and more interesting than the myths, then hit that like button. Subscribe to The Midnight Historian for more deep dives into the dark corners of history that textbooks gloss over. Because 2,000 years ago, Rome burned, and we're still trying to figure out why.